Hi, everyone. This is Rob Doggett from the International Yates Society and the State University at New York. And we're doing another Yates conversation. I'm here today with Tom Walker. Tom is an associate professor in Irish writing English at Trinity College in Dublin. A lot of people will know his book on Louis MacNeice that came out with Oxford in 2015. And he's, most of you know, he's written tons of articles. He's done a lot of editing. And recently, if you haven't seen it, it came out in 2024, is the Edinburgh Companion to Yeats and the Arts. And that came out that was co-edited with Charles Armstrong and Adrian Patterson. And I've written a couple of things over the past year, and I've used it every single time. It's a fantastic book, and I definitely encourage people to check it out. So it's nice to see you, Tom. How you doing?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you, and I look forward. You are running the next conference for the International Yates Society, and that's going to be in Dublin around Halloween. I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
Yeah, so that's coming up the end of October. So yeah, it should be really good. We got about I think we'll end up having about 40 or 50 speakers and we've got some fun things in store. We're hoping to bus everyone out to Dunsinane Castle,
Oh, that's cool.
which is a kind of Yatesian place, but I think is not one that's very often been kind of thought about or explored. So and it's just a kind of hour outside of Dublin. So I'm that's the bit I'm most intrigued by, really.
That sounds like fun.
And I'm co-organizing with my colleague Chris Marash. So yeah, so it's going to be fun.
Cool. And so we're recording in September of 2025.
Yeah.
So it's about a month out before it. So if you're watching this hot off the press, consider going to Dublin for the International Yates Society conference. It's going to be great. I think it's going to be a fantastic program, a lot of fun. So I asked you about poems to pick, and I was really happy to see you picked, what did you pick? The lover. And now I'm stumbling. The lover
The lover.
tells the rose in his heart.
Yeah.
Uh, it was. I was thinking about that poem. Most of my conversations, people tend to pick later poems, so
Yeah.
it's really nice to have a chance to focus on one from the 1890s. And I think it was written in the early 1890s, and then it was in of course, The Wind Among the Reeds. One of my favorite poems, and mildly embarrassed to say this, but when I at my wedding, which was about almost 30 years ago, I chose the last line of that poem to put on the little program they handed out to everyone. So that was me in my early 20s,
Wow, that's great.
smitten and in love. Yeah, so there you go. So anyway, so why'd you pick this thing?
So I chose it because I've been for a couple of reasons really. I'm trying to write this book about Yeats and art writing, and I've been trying to write it for longer than I care to have mentioned. But and it's become very clear to me that the early Yeats is really important to that project. And trying to kind of find ways to rethink what Yeats is up to in that period, both in terms of the kind of context that he's writing into, and also then I suppose the kind of challenges or a word I keep circling around is quest, the kind of quests he's kind of on, or it's a word he uses quite a lot in that period, and thinking about. So, and this poem seemed to me quite pivotal to both the kind of ways he's what he's writing in relation to, but also I suppose how he's trying to kind of head off into new directions. And it seemed to me quite an interesting kind of pivotal poem. As you said, it's written in 1892, but then it doesn't appear in book form till The Wind Among the Reeds. And I also find that kind of that really interesting. It's really quite a messy, prolonged period where he like he said he keeps telling people in interviews, or they keep running adverts for the book, and then it doesn't happen, and he
Hmm,
does other things. So I kind of find that intriguing as well.
hmm. Yeah, it's a poem that initially, when I was looking back and thinking about it, I was like, oh, it must be in the rose. And then
Yeah.
I thought, and then I realized, oh yeah, that's right. It's in The Wind Among the Reeds. So it's kind of interesting, that delay from when it was. And he mentions it earlier, of course, the poem when he mentions, I think, Although maybe it's later in his autobiographies, so it'd be much later. But he's talking about that period, and he mentions Mark
Yeah,
in connection
yeah,
with the poem. Yeah,
yeah. I mean, he publishes it
he has the
um almost as soon as he writes it, he publishes it in a magazine in the National Observer, where he's publishing a lot at that time. So it appears he possibly wrote it in November 1892, and then he publishes it like straight away in November 1892 in the National Observer, and he gives it a date. He says Sligo,
Sligo. That's right. Yeah, yeah.
November 1892, and it has a different name then. It's called just The Rose in My Heart.
Hmm.
Um, but then, yeah, as you say, he then dismantles his early work. He reframes it in, as we know, in poems 1895 in quite and that itself is quite a
Creating a
complicated
rose.
story.
Yeah, yeah.
And then yeah, and then eventually it appears, it's quite early on. It's the fourth poem,
Right,
in The Wind Among the Reeds, and by then it's changed its title,
right.
and it's one of those ones where he gives to a voice. It's kind of E or A, um, tells of the rose in his heart, and then eventually, in when he then revises things, in the 19 in ni- for the 1906 collected, it becomes the lover
Becomes a
tells of
lot.
the rose. So it's kind of, so it's one of those texts that he kind of he has, but he sits on, and then he changes the name. He doesn't actually change the text very much at all.
Hmm.
But yeah, so that's interesting, that kind of indeterminacy, but also that it's kind of it's obviously kind of a poem that's kind of in his thinking for a
Hmm.
long time.
Hmm.
You see what I mean?
And it is a poem, I think, as you're saying, that the more sort of context, the more rich the poem has become for me. Because when I first was, thinking about it for
Yeah.
my wedding, little whatever statement on the wedding program, yeah, it was just a love poem. And I think as you learn more about the context, a lot of the 1890s stuff, it becomes really, really interesting. But anyway, let's get into it, and I'll share my
Sure.
screen. And if you don't mind reading it, let's see if I can do this. I'm sharing my screen. Yes, perfect.
Okay.
It is shared.
So I'll read it. The lover tells of the rose in his heart. All things uncomely and broken, all things worn out and old, the cry of a child by the roadway, the creak of a lumbering cart, the heavy steps of the ploughman, splashing in the wintry mould, are wronging your image that blossoms a rose in the deeps of my heart. The wrong of unshapely things is a wrong too great to be told. I hunger to build them anew and sit on a green knoll apart, with the earth and the sky and the water remade like a casket of gold for my dreams of your image that blossoms a rose in the deeps of my heart.
That's nice, Tom. Thanks. Really interesting. It's sort of the first stanza is kind of noisy and messy,
Yeah.
and that shift into the second stanza, I always think into that kind of quietude is really lovely. And it's one of the things that always strikes me about the poem.
Yeah, I love the that kind of opposition between, yeah, between noise and image.
Yes.
Um,
Yeah.
which is very clear there. The cry, the creak, the heavy steps, the splashing.
Yeah.
Um, so the uncommonly and broken, yeah, seems to gravitate around noise, and then yeah, this image. Um, but it's a very that word image is obviously a kind of complicated one in poetry. We think of, an image as visual, but then also we think of the kind of internal vision. So
Mm.
it then goes very internal, right? It
Mhm.
blossoms a rose in the
Mhm.
deeps of my heart. And I hear the Lake Isle of Innisfree in the deep heart,
Mhm. Mhm.
which is again a very noisy poem,
Mhm.
um, and a poem that kind of orientates itself towards noise and somewhat away from material things.
Mhm.
Um, which so that's a kind of key opposition that Yeats keeps. If we think of later in the 1900s with the Saltery experiments and things, he keeps that kind of is a constant opposition and tension that
Mhm.
he's playing with. So yeah, so that's um, I like that opposition, and I think the Sligo. And Peter MacDonald says this in his edition that I was reading, thinking about this poem. That Sligo makes those noises somewhat kind of Irish and somewhat kind of quite potentially quite kind of cutting in the context of the 1890s and going back into the 1880s, if we think of eviction,
Yeah, I was just going to say that
and
I
kind of
remember.
agrarian agitation.
Yeah, I think I remember reading McDonald's piece on that a while ago and saying that it's some evoking some of those evictions, and of course, Maud was someone who was drawing
Yeah.
Maud Gunn was drawing a lot of attention to those
Y-
evictions. Well,
Yeah. And a lot of the context, immediate context of the poem and the editors of it do tend to gloss your image as well. That's Morgon. It's Morgon is the addressee. I think it's a bit more complicated than that. It's also a time where he's actually getting a little bit infatuated with Eva Booth actually, but
yeah.
in Sligo. But I think the poem kind of makes it so much more general as those Rose poems tend to do, right? Is it a woman? Is it something more mystical and kind of elusive? And it's also circular. It's going in and in. So particularly when we get that kind of line in for the final line for the second form, your
Hmm.
kind of your wedding line, as I'm now always going to think of it. For my dreams of your image that blossoms arose in the deeps of my heart. It's somewhat circular, right? My dreams, so the casket of gold is for my dreams so it's kind of driving his dreams of your image, and the image then blossoms. That's I mean, I'll come back to that word. It's interesting. The
Well,
image
yeah,
blossoms.
well, as we go
But
through and get to the end, we
yeah,
need to talk more about that lesson because it is way more one of the reasons I'm sort of embarrassed about it is it has this feel to it of talking about the beloved,
yeah,
and you don't realize how much this seems to be mediated and then internalized. Because it's not the beloved, it's the image of the beloved, right? And
yeah.
it's not
You're
just the image, it's the dreams. And the speaker's dreams. And so there's all this mediation. But the other thing I'm glad you said is about being careful about the biographical, the sort of biographical
mm,
reductiveness, because I do tend to, if I'm not careful, I slip into that sometimes, and I'll start talking about Maud Gunn in my classes, and then before you know it, then I'll be getting upset with my students for being too sort of literal and biographical. And I want to say, the Wind Among the Reeds is all of these different voices and all of these different moods, and we want to be careful about reducing it to one person and think of it as more generalizable. So I'm glad you said that as well. Um,
yeah.
Now you wanted to talk about some of the you have some slides.
Yeah, so I was kind of one of the ways I think about that kind of image and that idea of unshapely things and the image and the way that we seem to get a kind of idea of visual renewal, right? Like a casket of gold,
Mhm.
the earth, the sky, the water. So there's the image of the addressee, um, you know, versus the things that are broken. Um, I mean, I suppose I think when we tend to, one way to read early Yeats is obviously as we've been talking about, very biographical. Another way is obviously through his occultism,
Mhm.
and I suppose it's an adjunct to that his own critical writing, which actually often comes after the poem or a little bit. He often kind of writes poems or writes texts kind of afterwards. Even the stories of the Secret Rose are in some ways sometimes a kind of gloss on things he's already tried in his poems.
That's interesting.
But if we think of the Symbolist essays or the Blake essays, there's a lot of exegesis to explain his theories of the mood, and the poem
Mhm.
before this, In the Wind Among the Reeds, is the moods or the symbol, or there's a lot of or there's a kind of mode of thinking which I find it very hard to retain. I kind of envy people, but that kind of associative, this symbolizes this, that we get in a certain kind of kind of occultist symbolist reading of Yeats, which is really important, but I think is I find personally it's kind of something I find hard to, I kind of, it's not concrete. It's very associative.
Mhm.
Um, and those readings have been done and been done very well by lots of people. But I suppose I suppose I'm trying to think of it because the poem is visual and it's thinking about visual things and it uses that word things, um, which is a kind of interesting Yeats word. Is I do think about that some of the choices and fields Yeats is writing into and writing away from are distinctly visual.
Mhm.
So that word blossoms, wronging your image that blossoms a rose in the deeps of my heart. I put up these couple of pre-Raphaelite paintings, where the blossoming around the female kind of image is so kind of important and so kind of you know almost kind of disconcertingly bold, so that this Rossetti picture Venus Verticordia from the 1860s, where these flowers are kind of blossoming around this female figure, and then a
Yeah, I'll
much
just
more
say on that, Tom, it's interesting, and
yeah,
I don't know anything about the visual arts other than
yeah,
just a fan. But I don't know what you'd call it, but the sort of levels of that poem, or I'm sorry, of the painting, where it feels as if it's pushing forward. The flowers are coming toward
yeah,
you. It
yeah,
feels it's blossoming toward you, um, in
yeah. It's
space.
yeah, it's kind of crowding the field, and
Yeah.
it's the foreground, but as you say, the kind of it's a very depthless picture, so the background is kind of the kind of the more reddish
Yeah.
pinkish roses that, yeah, they're kind of crowding in on the female figure, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And you get it if you look into the background, you get that there's a kind of cavescape,
Mm,
but
mm,
there's not a lot of perspective going on there.
mm,
I mean, there would be a tradition, and there'd be traditions of kind of reading some of these things iconographically. Um, I don't want to get into that too much, but I do think that the um just that idea of blossoming the image, your image that blossoms a rose. I
mhm.
mean, it does feel to me like that Rossetti painting, it within the confines of what's obviously a static image, it's trying to kind of get that sense of the figure being acted upon
Yeah.
by those flowers, or the viewer the female figure and the flowers are kind of, they have designs on the viewer,
Yeah.
there's a kind of movement or agency there. um the Burne-Jones picture is much more contemporaneous to the Yeats poem, so it would have been first shown in London in 1890 as part of there's a whole series called the Briar Rose. William Morris, who's an important figure for Yeats at this time, writes some poems that accompany this series, and he's obviously very close to Burne-Jones. So, um, again, there's a whole series of these paintings. But they're kind of versions of kind of sleeping. I don't want to get into the mythical, but yeah, there's kind of Sleeping Beauty type
Mhm.
scenarios there. But again, this kind of humans being overtaken by these
Mm.
kind of growing roses as these figures who are asleep. And again, very erotic, it's hard to see in the slide, but in this, there's different versions of this painting by Burne-Jones, but some of them are like this sleeping figure is very eroticized, they're very tight. The clothes are very kind of tight around the female figure. And
Mhm. Mhm.
um, so, so I suppose my point is, when Yeats writes of, your image that blossoms a rose and making things anew, yes, he's thinking about the occult. Yes, he might be thinking about his real love life or lack of it. But I think there's a visual field there that's there's a kind of in play. And that I think one of his struggles is to find a kind of visual in his early work is actually to find a kind of visual vocabulary
Yeah.
for what he's trying to do in what is a very kind of crowded late romantic visual field, or we might, aestheticism, that goes back to, his father's generation and his father's friends.
Mhm.
But also, Rossetti in the 1880s, particularly becoming a really kind of prominent public figure, and then Burne-Jones as well, in the kind of aesthetic. I suppose as the aestheticism goes kind of pretty mainstream.
Mhm.
Um, if we think of the things like the Grosvenor Gallery, or, Oscar Wilde, and there's a kind of visual aspect to that I think Yeats is in sympathy with a lot of these people, and he's writing a kind of we think of his texts as being Irish, but they're also very medievalist. They're very kind of
Mhm. Mhm.
he's kind of shifting Arthurianism a tiny bit away across the water, but not that much. If you think, a lot of knights and romance. Romance is a very important word to the early Yeats as well.
Mhm.
But I think there's a visual aspect to that, and I think one of his challenges is actually that he's kind of articulating in this poem is how to remake the aesthetic. But what's that actually gonna? look like? What are these symbols going to be? How they and I think this poem kind of articulates that in interesting ways for me. And I find that sit on a green knoll apart. So he's going to build them anew, but he's also going to sit on a green knoll apart. That green. I mean, again, I find it hard to not think of a kind of national resonance to that.
Hmm.
Um, and also, there's also a very unusual word in this poem, which I think also relates to that kind of visual field and that sense of the aesthetic, and that's wrong. Wronging, the wrong of unshapely things, a wrong too great to be told. Yeats doesn't use the word wrong very often, but
I
we
was
get it.
thinking that it is
Yeah.
as you're reading the poem aloud, that is the word early on that really stands out because it seems out of tune with the sort of he's talking about sort of mundane reality.
Yeah.
And then to say that this kind of world is wronging something seems quite strong and
Yeah. I mean, I
surprising.
suppose, yeah,
Yeah.
I suppose to my mind, it very much evokes, particularly the work of John Ruskin, but a kind of a very moralistic kind of patrician, but also, very angry,
Mhm.
um, judgmental kind of public aesthetic discourse that, I suppose you think of Ruskin, you perhaps think of Arnold on
Mhm.
Carlyle, but I
Mhm.
think particularly with the visual field, you think of Ruskin. Ruskin will say, this art is wrong. It's immoral. It's the sign of the mistreating of souls.
Yeah.
This building or this particular mode of painting. It's not just that it's bad, it's wrong.
Hmm.
And there is something about that, the sense that the a wronged society will produce a wronged art, or wronged works of art are manifestations of, moral and societal kind of problems and degradations. Um, that's a very Ruskinian idea, but I think that is here in that poem. I
It's
find that line,
fascinating. I hadn't, thinking about this poem normally for me is often I go into the occult and with those references to the different elements and the sort of alchemical stuff, and then the particular way the rose, the different resonances of the rose, and thinking here, well, okay, we've got this occult level, and then we've got the sort of romance level, and ideal beauty. I've never taught the poem really in direct dialogue with the discourse surrounding, aestheticism and that kind of language uh, from the Victorian era. But it makes total sense now to think to read the poem in relation to someone like Ruskin.
yeah, I mean that line, the wrong of unshapely things
Yeah.
is a wrong too great to be told.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you think of, um, Ruskin, who couldn't stop writing. I mean, the collective Ruskin is a
Yeah.
huge,
Yeah.
it's an endless. You can't read Ruskin in ways. He wrote so much. Um, you know, so it's interesting for someone to be writing in 1892. Is a wrong too great to be told. But actually, there's been people saying how wrong unshapely things are at length,
Hmm.
particularly Ruskin, but others as well, for a lot of the 19th century. So, so it's interesting. It's almost like Yeats is kind of, that's not going to be his way. He's going to build anew. He's going to do it in this other way, in this kind of, this dreamy
Hmm.
kind of, but also very inward driving kind of way. But I think there is that kind of sense that that's the thing that's a starting point of this
Hmm.
poem, or a starting point for this kind of, again, that word quest.
Hmm.
Um, but one of the things involved in that is well, quite what is that going to look like?
Right.
Or
Right.
what are these things going to be? What are these more shapely built new things going to actually be, that
Yeah.
are going to kind of lead to then this kind of rose questing process, which is a somewhat inward process, or as figured here.
Shall we go to the next?
Yeah, so I suppose kind of thinking about that idea of kind of what is this going to look like in 1892.
Mm.
um he writes this poem. He's republished um the second edition of The Wanderings of Oisin. So Fisher Unwin have rebound some of the old sheets, but they add a frontispiece And this is an incredibly rare book. I think there's only
I've
about
never, I've never
yeah,
seen
it's
that.
incredibly rare. So this frontispiece,
Wow.
which is pretty bad, I think. I mean, I think the reason why he doesn't reuse it. So this is by Edwin Ellis, his friend, his father's friend, who's an
Yeah.
artist, but who he's at this point deep into Blake with. He's re-editing Blake with. Um, which um, and Ellis, I mean, is a fascinating figure. But we get St. Patrick and Oisin, and we've got Neve here, who is, it's very like Rossetti, right? This kind of the hair, this female figure, and Ellis is completely steeped in Rossetti. That like Rossetti is the kind of contemporary god of this his father's circle. Who are also obsessed by Blake and
Mhm.
but this kind of pre-Raphaelite satellites figures that his dad is friends with in London. So um, I think it's really interesting that this is a frontispiece. It's somewhat shaped by his father's friends. It's something he abandons, um, but it is there, and I think that is that kind of sense of, well, what is this going to look like? What is this thing, this new image, this new building? What is it going to look like? Um, I think ultimately it's not going to look very much like this, and we'll talk about that. But
Right.
but I think that false choice, or that kind of that vi visual vocabulary, which is very strong, it's there for him. And he's having to kind of work with it, but then also away from it.
Yeah.
Um, if maybe if you go to the next slide, we can kind of see this from a slightly different angle. So again, in the same year, so by the time he writes this poem, these two books have come out earlier in the year. So the collection that precedes it, the Countess Kathleen and various legends and lyrics, it has this frontispiece, which is by another of his father's friends, John Nettleship. Um, and this is of Cuchulainn. So, a much more heroic picture, but it's very kind of medievalist. It's kind of the kind of winged helmet. I mean, I think of Wagner. You think of later poems where he talks about, throwing these helmets into the pit, these kind of self-reflective poems. And he's going to kind of have figures who have to be dressed a bit like this in the theater,
Mhm.
which he then works quite hard to kind of change. But there is, doing this in 1892, there's been a lot of this in the from the mid 19th century on, really. A lot of this kind of medievalism. And that's the visual vocabulary that he's framing his work in, somewhat, with these kind of friends of his father's. I think there was interesting questions of kind of influence and agency there.
Mhm.
Um, but so that's happening just before these poems.
Mhm. Mhm.
And it's a kind of visual field. I think it's relevant to the poems,
Yes, absolutely.
relevant to this poem.
And you can, I mean, you can just see like this is not the field. That this is not what he's aiming. Neither of those is what Yates is clearly aiming for.
Yeah,
Whatever he's going to create. Yeah, I think that makes absolute sense. I have seen this one, and I always kind of chuckle when I see the
yeah,
this
yeah.
piece.
And I find this book really interesting. Um, it begins with the play. I mean, we now think of it as a play, but in this book, it's not. It's a kind of clearly a verse drama or a dramatic poem. And he talks about it as almost like a pair in a pair with the Wanderings of Oisin. So the Wanderings of Oisin is the kind of epic, and this is the dramatic. The
Mhm.
Wanderings of Oisin is pagan, and this is Christian.
Mhm.
Um, and then he follows it by the lyrics, which we would now think of as the Rose.
Right, yeah.
Um, and that the section of lyrics, the various legends and lyrics, they begin with a rose poem. So they begin to the rose upon the rood of time, and then that sequence then ends with the poem we now know as to Ireland in the Coming Times. It's then called Apologia, addressed to Ireland in the Coming Times, where again Yeats reaffirms his quest after the red rose bordered hem.
Mhm.
So the rose is emerging, and then in 1895, we obviously in when he reorders things a lot. In the poems of 1895, we get the rose as a standalone sequence,
Mhm.
and we're probably many of us who teach Yates are familiar with having to try and explain to our students that that's not really a book, that never really existed.
Yeah, that wasn't a book.
Um, and I always get students who write an essay, in the Rose published 1893, and you're like, no, it's not quite like that. But
Yeah.
uh, but yeah, but it's interesting. So he writes this poem that we're talking about the Lover Tales of the Rose. But then he spends the next 3 years reordering his work.
Mhm.
Um, and again, if you maybe jump ahead to the next slide, um,
Yeah, and that's 18. That's
yeah,
post.
so he gets this frontispiece and this cover by an artist called Herbert Grenville Fell. That I mean, he chooses this artist. He goes to an exhibition of black and white work and sees this artist, but he's very dissatisfied with it. Um, but again, we might think of you know, this offering. I mean, I actually think the kind of the frontispiece is more cliched. The cover's a bit weirder, the actual book cover. But the kind of knight, the sword, it's very Burne-Jones kind of medievalist world. Um, you know, um, and but he's at speed. He's kind of trying to work away from that. Um, Again, if you go to the next slide, we can see the
Yeah, the order.
I find the contents of these collections very interesting. They actually move around quite a lot. So he does the 1895 and then he does a second edition in 1899 and he does move it around a fair bit. And then obviously we're as readers probably most familiar now with the way we this comes at us in the collected poems, um, where you actually get Crossways and then the Rose. But actually we get the in the first printing we get the Wandering Machine and the Countess and the Land of Heart's Desire first. So he front loads the long poems and the verse dramas. Then we get the Rose, then the cross. So the kind of order's all over the place from what we would be maybe more familiar now.
Very, very different experience. And I
Yeah,
talked a little bit about this when I had to, that I did not to plug anything I've done, but the edition for Penguin Classics.
yeah,
And we talked a lot about this, and I said I wanted to use poems 1895 as the basis, this ordering, because people
yeah,
are so used to the one you get. I have my Albright one
yeah,
here,
yeah,
thinner in that different ordering. And I just think it's such a different experience of opening to the Wanderings of Oisin, and then more, then the Countess Kathleen, get that drama first, and then the Rose poetry. When you open the collected, most editions of the collected poems, you start with the Song of the Happy Shepherd. Yeats is a different kind of poet. I mean,
yeah, yeah,
and also the lyric, and I know, and I know this, that later debates about the collected poems and people, the publisher thinking, well, who's going to want to open up a book and find this giant narrative poem, The Wanderings of Oisin? Why don't we shift it to a different section and all that whole debate? But
yeah,
I do think just looking at this ordering is really striking, and thinking about Yeats's conflicting ideas about himself and self-presentation, and how he's announcing himself in this kind of book, is
yeah,
quite different than what we get if we had started with the poems that became grouped under Crossways.
yeah. And so I mean, yeah, that kind of question of what is the image he's giving? What's the shape
Yeah,
of his work, of his body of work, and the
yeah.
the ordering to that. Um, and even like questions like, we think of the Countess Kathleen and the Land of Heart's Desire, that they're in the drama, they're plays, they obviously they're performed at various points, but here then they're kind of poems. I mean, we're kind of back to the Victorian closet drama to an extent.
It is
Um,
interesting to think about them that way, because that's not general. I mean, I've just thought, oh, they're plays, but
yeah,
you're right. When you think about how they are in 1895 here, they do feel more like that kind of closet drama. Um, yeah,
yeah,
that is interesting and striking.
and the Countess Kathleen in particular, it's very like it's very kind of Morris. I always think it's kind of like a William Morris poem, or like I mean, he's William Morris is changing a lot in this period as well. He's writing these prose romances, which again, where you get this kind of indeterminate, kind of medieval-ish world,
Mhm.
but they also can be somewhat futuristic or somewhat atemporal. But but you get these female figures.
Mhm.
You get these kind of people in courts. There's a lot of stuff about tapestries, as you might expect. But that's kind of all there a bit in early Yeats.
For sure.
This kind of which Yeats is very close to. And then, but I mean, what's fascinating is he's reordering this also in real time and at speed. So it's not just about later debates or the 1933 collected, or actually by the time he gets to the second edition of poems, so in 1899, which has the very famous, beautiful Althea Giles cover,
Mhm.
he has already reordered it. So it begins with the Countess Kathleen, then you go the Rose, then the Anne of Hearts Die, Crossways, then the Wanderings of Oisin. So this is really unstable, and it kind of stays like that. It kind of stays like that for a while then. But um, but it's interesting to think of. Yeah, he's what does this look like? What's he trying to kind of form? But also thinking, if you go, back to that cover and that frontispiece that he's dissatisfied with, and then he eventually finds something he's very pleased by.
Right.
So I put some of these Giles covers, which are super famous.
Yeah.
So the first one is The Secret Rose. So that's not a great image. It's a little bit blurry, but you get the idea. And then and then you get the poems from
It's
the
beautiful.
second edition of poems, and then she also
Beautiful.
does The Wind Among the Reeds. Oh, I now suddenly doubted myself. I think she does The Wind Among the Reeds as well. Yeah.
Yes.
Um, which I think is an amazing cover. So I think
They're
it's my favorite,
gorgeous. Absolutely gorgeous.
all of them.
Yeah. Those,
Particularly the back cover, the kind of unraveled
uh-huh.
um uh they're kind of reeds, but they're also obviously kind of look like bits of cloth.
Yeah.
um it's kind of yeah, amazing. But I do think there is kind of I think one of his quests, and we see it in these poems of the eventual collection, the Wind Among the Reeds, is yeah, this quite, what form is this going to take? In some ways this poem is quite accessible. It's quite well mannered in terms of shape. Um, it's a little bit abstract. We will come back to that last line, maybe that's really interesting. But but if you think about where the Wind Among the Reeds is going, it's going to get really abstract. It's going to get apocalyptic. Particularly the poems to E. So the
Mhm.
poems that have this speaker, they're often kind of, they have this female addressee. They're often quite, they even imagine her or wishing her death.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, they, but they're also kind of willing to think about reordering the world, the kind of chaos, reordering the cosmos,
Hmm.
in an attempt to find beauty. So they're really willing to go a very long way in that kind of aesthetic quest. Um, but I think a problem of the early Yeats is, well, what's that going to look like? Or how's that going to be in any way communicable or knowable or tangible? The Wind Among the Reeds is amazing, but it's kind it, it's a dead end in some ways, right? Yeats, he then starts writing very different things fairly soon afterwards. Um,
It's really interesting to think of these terms. I haven't, I think it's useful to approach these poems from with that notion of quest
mm,
and the kind of labor involved with this quest and a labor to find this kind of visual, the proper visual vocabulary in this world that's so steeped in all of these other sort of Victorian sort of modes. And, for me, it's always when I talk about the Wind Among the Reeds, there are always these moments of gesturing towards that, whatever this culmination is. I haven't really thought about it in those quest terms, but it,
yeah,
it makes total sense. And not being able to, it holds off at the moment. It sort of like looks toward it, but we don't know how it would manifest itself, whatever that ultimate kind of vision is.
yeah.
There's always a kind of stopping short of it or gesturing towards it, but not being able to um, or represent it in some way.
Yeah, and I mean, if we kind of go back to the poem,
To the poem.
we're getting that in that last line, right? For my dreams of your image that blossoms a rose in the deeps of my heart. So there's something quite circular there, as I already mentioned, but there's also like, it's many staged, right? So, I hunger to build them anew. I'm gonna have to sit on a green knoll apart with the earth and the sky and the water remade. So he's kind of making twice. So he's having
Right.
to restate that, and then we're getting this simile, which is an odd one, like a casket of gold.
Can I ask real quickly on this one? This is
Yeah.
puzzled me a little bit. I know in America, of course, when my students read it in American English, casket is used kind of interchangeably with coffin.
Yeah,
Just
yeah,
to remind them of casket as a little kind of jewel box or something as the sort
yeah.
of British English. I didn't know if it had. I mean, I don't know, for sure. But
I wouldn't have.
1890s, does it have any
Yeah,
kind of association with death, or is it really here just the kind of little ornamental box kind of thing?
that's a great question. I don't know really. Yeah, I mean, I suppose if we think of kind of, I mean, I don't know if casket in that kind of sense of coffin, that kind of North American.
Right,
I would have to look that up if that's a great question though. But I mean, certainly if we think of, treasure,
right.
Pandora's box, these things are always a bit dangerous, right?
Yes.
There's always like a kind of element of death there.
Yeah.
I think there's also a sense of like, um, the kind of revivalist renewal where you have to go back to dead things to make new things.
Yeah.
So, again, MacDonald points out that, Casket of Gold, Yeats at this point, around this time, he's writing in his prose a bit about the National Museum's just been founded, just been
Mhm.
opened. And one of the things that they do in a couple of years before, I think it's 1891, and a few people have written about this. Rennie Fox written about this a bit as well.
Yeah.
They bring the treasure collection, so these kind of beautiful gold torques and really fine gold work, from the it's brought into the museum. So I think it's previously been at I can't remember if it's the Royal Irish Academy or um the Royal RHA, the Royal Hibernian Academy. I think this must be in the Royal Irish Academy. But anyway, there's a kind of this treasure trove. So things that are now quite famous, things like the Armagh chalice and
Mhm.
this kind of thing, are put on public display. Museum, and Dublin has this national museum with this kind of archaeological focus. So, and Yeats writes about that in some of his journalism of the time. He's spending a lot of time in the National Library, which is literally across the square, up the road, across the road from the new museum in this kind of new museum complex,
Mhm.
that's growing up on Kildare Street in Dublin. So, um, so it's interesting. Yeah, there is that kind of museum aspect to this. And if we think of, build them anew, again, this is Yeats already is so deep into institution building. So the other, these layers of things that are going on in his life in 1892. One of them is the literature of the Library of Ireland project,
Yes.
and also the foundation of the I always try and get these names wrong. I'm now trying to remember which it's the National Literary Society, which is coming. So these revivalist institutions which are started in London are actually kind of coming back a bit to Dublin. I mean, it famously ends in a dispute with Gavin Duffy. But so I think later that month, Douglas Hyde is going to give his famous speech about the necessity for the de-Anglicization of Ireland. So that's all happening now.
Mhm.
So when you're talking about building them anew, Yates really is institution building on that green knoll. Um, and the casket of gold is a little bit a part, a part of that. So you're getting earth and sky and water, which we might, this kind of traditional kind of pastoralism investment in Irish landscape, but also, yeah, this institution building, in museums, archaeology, antiquarian archaeological kind of perspectives. I
God,
think
it's
they're
really,
all
it's
resonating
really,
in the poem.
yeah, it's really interesting. Like I never put the poem in that kind of context, that sort of nation building, cultural nationalism, revivalist and antiquarian, and then of course looking back to antiquarianism, that sort of stuff. I never put the poem in that context. I mean, for me, again, as I was saying before, it's always like occult stuff and love poetry.
Yeah,
And you're absolutely right, though. I mean, in that context, to talk about remaking this world, especially when you think about what you pointed out early on, which I tend to forget too, because we're used to seeing it in the collected poems, but the Sligo date, having Sligo in the date, it
mm,
sort of localizes that first stanza and thinking about what, in some ways, what is being remade. And it all ties in, I think, with the kind of the many interests Yeats had in revival during this period. So it's
yeah,
fascinating to think about
yeah,
that way. So the last line then we'll culminate here with because it is really
sure,
complicated line for my
yeah,
your image that I mean, first of all, the simile, by the way, is, I mean, it's just complicated to follow the syntax a little bit, but
Mm.
the simile is to the remade the earth and the sky and the water, that world, the unshapely things that he will remake will be like a casket of gold, first of
Yeah,
all,
yeah,
right? And then what is it for, who or what is it for?
yeah.
And that's what we
So,
get at the end.
yeah, so for my dreams of your image.
Yeah.
So it's not really much of a love poem, right? I mean, it's not like I'm not gonna remake this for you. It's for my dreams, right? So your image
You're
is,
making my choice of for my wedding worse and worse
you
by the
know,
second here. Yes.
yeah, so it's a very kind of musy, you know, you're gonna help me do the great thing, right? For my dreams of your image that blossoms a rose. So your image is going to blossom a rose. So again, I think of that Rossetti painting,
Right,
there's
right.
the kind of blossoming, there's a kind of activity there.
Yeah.
Um, a rose in the deeps of my heart. So again, back to myself, back to my kind of my again I hear the Sligo, I hear the Innisfree, my deep's heart core. Um, but also that kind of that deep mind, if we think of Yeats, this opposition between kind of mind and matter, this sense of a kind of profound subjectivity, which some of his occultist kind of thinking, that you're quite sometimes quite hierarchical kind of Neoplatonic thinking, kind of going back to this extreme subjectivity, which he thinks we're kind of trying to dream back towards. I mean, all this stuff, um, some of which he certainly hasn't articulated yet, but there is that kind of journeying to something which is obviously a soul's journeying, beyond things, beyond the body. I mean, again, if we think about that kind of journey of images we've seen, one of the things that it disappears from from the covers, from the frontispieces, is the body,
Yeah.
right? So he begins those early ones done by friends of his father, or for the 1895 poems, they're very bodily. Um, but by the end, it's going very abstract.
That's exactly it, because and that's why it's so. As soon as I saw that one, the frontispiece from, I think it was the Countess Kathleen,
Yeah,
which I had not seen before. It's just not, because it's because of the bodies. I mean,
yeah,
you just like, this is not what he's going for here. And the Koholin one always struck me as really corny, in the same way. And it's and that, as you're explaining it, that's exactly right. I never thought about why do I always why does the Wind Among the Reeds cover always sort of, I've it always resonates with me, because I think, well, this, you get the better sense, and maybe partly it's because I knew Yates liked that cover much more.
mm, mm, mm.
But part of it, I think, is it just really, it jibes with what I think Yates is doing, and that movement away from the sort of realistic representation of the body into something else.
Yeah, yeah. And I think one of I find it interesting. Um, there's a kind of worry. It's not actually that much in this poem, but some other poems about kind of seeing in Yeats. The text I think that's kind of obviously he is shadowing everything. Excuse the pun. Is the shadowy waters. This kind of you
Uh,
know trying to see, that problem of perception. Um, you know, I think is so the image, wronging your image, and that double sense of, image, or that double sense of vision, in these different forms of romantic vision, think of the mirror and the lamp and all that kind of thing. But there is like this, um, I think there is a kind of anxiety about things, but also about seeing,
mhm.
that it is kind of slightly running through this work. And, and, The Wind Among the Reeds is, it's very acclaimed at the time. It's obviously, but, we think of it as the kind of culmination of his early lyric work. Um, but it's also something he very much doesn't do and cannot do,
Yeah.
or chooses not to do again. Um, and you know, it's going to become very biographical, very rooted in the contemporary. So the the historicism, the occultism, that's all going to be there, but it's always going to be much more kind of grounded in something more tangible and more kind of self-like.
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
in if we think from the 1900s on, we get this kind of great life writing project, really, that all his work in some way, with perhaps with the exception of the drama, becomes. Um, so it's interesting, that there is a yeah kind of extreme subjectivity or extreme kind of mind or deeps of my heart. However that's kind of been figured that this poem is a kind of starting point for, but also a starting point for the difficulty of that project, I think.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think that's a great way to wrap up. This was such a, God, I love these conversations because I say this often. I get set in the ways that I talk about poems with Yeats, and these conversations always open up so many more contexts. And I think the next time I teach this, I'd like to do it in a class that's tied in with aestheticism and sort of maybe have this as the at the end of the semester, do something on the Yeats in the 1890s as the kind of end of the course would be kind of
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah,
Be a lot of fun. So, well, it was a real pleasure seeing you, Tom, and I look forward to. I'll see you in Dublin
great.
at the conference. And anybody watching this video, too, keep an eye out for advertisements for the Yates International Summer School that's run in Sligo in the summer. It's fantastic, and Tom and I are going to be co-directing it for the summer of 20. What is this? 20, it'd be the summer of
Yeah,
2026. We
yes, yeah,
have a really good program for that.
yeah.
All right. Well, thank you again, and I'll
Thanks,
talk
Rob.
to you soon.
Yeah.